There's something about the long hours of early morning that changes the way sound travels. The world gets quieter, and in that quiet, things you might otherwise dismiss start to feel significant. A voice where there shouldn't be one. A warning about a place you haven't been. A detail so specific it couldn't be a coincidence. And yet you can't explain it any other way. What you're about to hear is a collection of accounts from people who drove alone at night, who kept a CB radio on mostly for company, and who received messages that didn't make sense until the road ahead made them make sense. None of them fully understand what happened. Most of them still think about it. Take a moment, breathe. The rest of this story unfolds in your mind. Now put on your headphones. Before we begin, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. There's something about knowing others are awake in the dark too. Story 1. The Overpass on Route 9. I almost didn't tell anyone about this because I was afraid of how it would sound. And honestly, I'm still not sure how to frame it without sounding like I imagined the whole thing. This was about 4 years ago. I was driving long haul at the time, mostly regional runs, nothing glamorous. Manufactured parts from a distribution center in Pennsylvania, down to warehouses scattered across Virginia and the Carolinas. The routes were familiar enough that I stopped really seeing them. You get that way after a while. The road becomes wallpaper. It was a Tuesday night going into Wednesday. I remember that specifically because I'd been annoyed about it. I had tickets to my nephew's birthday party that Sunday, and I'd been worried about making it back in time, so I'd taken a midweek run to free up the weekend. I left the loading dock at around 11 in the evening, which put me on the interstate just before midnight. I kept the CB on Channel 19 out of habit. Most nights it was quiet. Occasionally you'd hear another trucker report a speed trap or a lane closure. Background noise, basically. Comfortable background noise. I was maybe 90 minutes into the drive when things started feeling off. Not dramatically, nothing you could point at. The traffic was lighter than usual, which sometimes happens midweek, and I'd gone probably 40 minutes without seeing another vehicle going either direction. That's not unheard of on that stretch, but it started to register somewhere in the back of my mind. The CB had been silent for a long time when it made a soft click, like someone keying the mic, but not speaking right away. I glanced at the unit. The channel light was steady. Then a voice came through. Male, middle-aged sounding. Calm but deliberate. He said, and I'm paraphrasing as closely as I can, "Northbound driver on 9, there's debris in the right lane just past the overpass at mile marker 61. Take it slow." I noted it, thanked him on the radio. He didn't respond. I looked at my mile marker. I was at 34. I had a ways to go before 61, but the information registered. Here's the thing I want you to understand. I didn't think anything was wrong at that point. I genuinely didn't. A CB warning about road debris is exactly the kind of thing the CB is for. I appreciated it, filed it away, and kept driving. But about 20 minutes later, I caught myself thinking about the transmission. And something nagged at me. The man had said, "Northbound driver on 9. Singular, like he was talking to one specific person. Like he could see me. I looked around out of reflex, which was silly. I was alone on the road, no vehicles behind me, nothing in the southbound lanes, and the transmission had come and gone without anyone else responding or acknowledging it. I told myself there were probably other trucks I couldn't see. Maybe he was parked on an overpass himself, watching traffic. It wasn't impossible. I let it go. At mile 61, I came up on the overpass, and there was something in the right lane. A long strip of what looked like a blown truck tire, the shredded rubber kind that can shred your own tires if you hit it wrong. I moved left well in advance and passed it without any trouble. And I remember thinking, that was useful. That was exactly right. He told me exactly where it would be. I got to the warehouse, unloaded, slept in the cab for a few hours, and drove back the next afternoon. I didn't think much about it on the return trip. The thing that started bothering me came later. It came about 2 weeks after, when I was back on the same route, and I mentioned the transmission to another driver I knew. A guy named Harlan, who'd been running that corridor for 15 years. I told him about the CB warning, about the debris at 61, about how accurate it was. He got quiet in a way that wasn't comfortable. Then he asked me what time it had been when I got the transmission. I thought about it. I left at 11. I'd been driving around 90 minutes, maybe a little more. So, roughly 12:30, maybe 1 in the morning. He shook his head slowly and said that it didn't match up with something, but he didn't explain what. When I pushed him, he said he'd heard a similar transmission once, on a different stretch, and that it had come through at a very specific time. He said he'd checked his dashcam timestamp when he got home because the whole thing had bothered him. He said the timestamp read 3:17 a.m., and that the voice had warned him about a curve he was approaching, describing the exact spot. He'd been shaken because the curve had been badly iced over, and if he'd been moving at his normal speed, he would have gone off the shoulder. I told him that wasn't my situation. My transmission had been earlier in the night. He said he knew, and he said he wasn't sure what to make of that. He wasn't saying our experiences were the same thing. He just went quiet and changed the subject. What bothers me isn't the warning itself. The warning was helpful. What bothers me is that the voice said, northbound driver on 9. Not any northbound drivers, not, hey, anyone heading north. It was directed, specific, and there was no one else on that road for as far as I could see. I've never heard that voice again. I've run that route maybe 24 times since. The CB stays on channel 19. Whoever it was, they haven't called again. I don't know if I want them to. Story 2. Mile marker 220. My grandfather drove long haul for 30 years and used to say that the CB radio was like a party line. Everyone's business was everyone's business, and you never really knew who was listening. I thought about that a lot after what happened on I-80 in the fall of 2019. I wasn't a trucker. I want to be clear about that because it changes some of the context. I was a nurse working overnight shifts at a hospital about 2 hours from where I lived. I'd moved away from the area when I got the position and never found a closer apartment I could afford, so for about a year I drove that commute. 4 nights a week, 2 hours each way. I'd leave around 9 in the evening and get home around 8 in the morning. The CB was my ex-husband's idea, actually. He'd used one for years as a hobby, and when I told him I was nervous about driving alone on a long rural stretch in the middle of the night, he set one up in my car and walked me through the basics. He said if I ever broke down or felt unsafe, I could reach someone. It made him feel better. It made me feel slightly less alone on those long, quiet drives. Most nights I heard nothing useful. Occasionally truckers chatting. Once someone was singing quietly to themselves, forgetting they had the mic keyed. Little things. The night I'm talking about was in November. It had gotten cold early that year, and I remember the heater in my car was working too well, making me drowsier than usual. I had the window cracked and the radio on, alternating between music and the CB out of habit. I was somewhere around the 200-mile marker, still about 40 minutes from home, when the CB clicked. The voice was a man's, very calm, very even. He said, "There's a car stopped on the right shoulder around mile 220. Might want to slow down." I said thank you and asked if they'd seen any flashers on. He didn't respond. I kept my speed but moved into the left lane. At mile 220, there was a car on the right shoulder. No hazard lights. Dark. I slowed as I passed it and could just make out a shape inside. Someone sitting in the driver's seat, head down. I couldn't tell if they were asleep or something worse. I pulled over about 100 yards past the car and called 911. Gave them the mile marker, describing what I'd seen. They said they'd send someone out. I waited until I saw headlights in the distance that I assumed were the responding unit, and then I continued home. I found out later from a highway patrol friend that the car had belonged to an elderly man who'd had a medical episode. He was okay. They'd gotten him to the hospital in time. His hazard lights hadn't been working. I should have felt good about that, and I did for a little while. But later, I started thinking about the transmission, and I realized several things that I hadn't fully processed in the moment. The first was that when the voice said mile 220, he'd been precise. He didn't say around mile 220 the way you might estimate. He gave the marker like he'd read it. The second thing was that I had not seen any other vehicles for a long time, before or after that moment. The road had been empty in both directions for as far as I could tell in the dark. And the third thing, and this is the one that still sits uneasily in my chest, is that mile marker 220 was still in front of me when the transmission came. The voice warned me about something ahead, something I hadn't passed yet. I've tried to explain this in various ways over the years. Someone on an overpass, someone who'd driven past the car earlier and was reporting it to anyone in the area. Those explanations work, mostly. They almost work. What they don't explain is why, when I checked the time I'd received the transmission against my phone records from when I'd called 911, there was a gap that didn't make sense. The 911 call was logged at 3:24 a.m. I'd waited probably 5 minutes before calling, which means the transmission came at approximately 3:17 in the morning. I didn't notice that until much later. When I was telling someone else the story and they asked me the time, I went back and checked. I'd been hoping I was wrong. I wasn't. Story 3. The voice that knew my name. Something happened on a solo drive last winter that I haven't been able to file away neatly, and I've tried. I do wildlife research, the kind that requires long drives to remote monitoring sites, often at night, because the animals I study are nocturnal. I'm comfortable with dark roads. I've been doing this for 8 years, and I'm not easily rattled by strange sounds or unusual encounters. It's part of the job. Last January, I was heading out to a site in a high desert area. I won't get more specific than that. To retrieve sensor data and check on a set of camera traps. The drive from the nearest town was about 2 hours on a combination of state highway and then a long unpaved road that wound up into the hills. I kept a CB in the research truck because the cellular signal in that region is essentially non-existent, and occasionally other researchers or ranchers in the area would communicate on a shared channel. It was a practical tool, nothing more. I was on the paved section, maybe 30 minutes from where the road turned to gravel, when the radio clicked. A voice said my name. Not my last name, not my title, my first name, the name people who know me use. I remember going very still. I turned the volume up slightly and sat there waiting. The voice continued. It was a man, calm, unhurried. He said something like, "There's a gate across the access road about a mile past the junction. Someone must have closed it after the last survey. You'll need the combination. It's the same one from last spring." I remember my hands were tight on the wheel. Because the voice was right. The gate was a potential issue. I'd actually emailed my supervisor about it the week before, asking about access codes, and I hadn't gotten a response. I'd planned to deal with it when I got there. I did, in fact, have the code from last spring written in my field notebook, and I'd been hoping it still worked. But no one should have been on that channel who knew my name. The research team communicated on a designated frequency that I kept separately on a handheld radio. The truck's CB was on a general channel. I called back. I said my name and asked who I was talking to. No response. I called again. Nothing. I drove. At the junction, about a mile down the access road, there was a gate across the path. It had been closed. I stopped the truck and got out and walked up to it. And I stood there in the cold dark for a moment before I tried the code. The code from last spring worked. I drove through and went about my work, and tried very hard not to think about what had just happened. I made my notes, retrieved my data, and drove back out. The CB was quiet the rest of the night. When I got to where my cell signal came back, I called my supervisor and asked who might have known about the gate. She said she'd actually called the rancher who managed that property the day before to check on access, and that he'd mentioned the gate had been closed recently. She said she'd meant to let me know, but had forgotten. She didn't know my CB channel, the rancher didn't know my name. Or maybe he did. I'd done work on that land before. We'd met briefly. Maybe he'd been on his own radio and happened to use the same channel and happened to know who was coming out. There are a lot of maybes. What I keep coming back to is not the name. Names can be coincidences in a stretch. What I keep coming back to is the timing. I checked my field log when I got home. I had a habit of noting major waypoints with time. I'd written down the moment I heard the transmission because the name had startled me. 3:17 a.m. I don't know what to do with that. I've shared this with one colleague who didn't say much, just nodded slowly, like it confirmed something they'd been considering. They didn't explain what. I didn't ask. Story 4. Dead channel. The first time I heard it, I thought it was interference. The second time, I knew it wasn't. I was doing overnight security transport. Not exciting work, mostly driving sealed packages between facilities. The kind of job where you're not supposed to know what you're moving and you learn quickly not to ask. The company gave us company vehicles, and the vehicles came with CB units already installed. Standard practice in the industry, they told us. The first night I heard anything unusual, I'd been on the job for about 3 months. I was on a stretch of state highway in the Midwest, 2-lane road, empty as a parking lot at 4 a.m. The CB had been dead quiet for hours. There was a burst of static, and then a voice came through clearly. Male, flat affect, the way someone sounds when they're reporting information rather than having a conversation. He said, "Road's washed out ahead. The bridge is flooded at the county line. Take the detour at Fulton Road." I looked at the clock on the dash. I noticed the time because I was tired and had been watching the clock. It was 3:17 in the morning. I got on the radio and asked for clarification. Asked who I was talking to. Asked if anyone else had eyes on the flooding. No response. Silence. I kept driving and thinking. About 15 minutes later, I came to a county road intersection where a handwritten sign on a sawhorse said "Road flooded. Detour." An arrow pointed left. I took the left, which added about 25 minutes to my route, and eventually the road curved back to rejoin my original route past the flooded point. I didn't think about the timing until I was home and running the night through my head before sleep. The 3:17 on the dash. The voice that had given me information I needed before I needed it. The second time it happened was 6 weeks later. Different route, different state, same job. The same kind of still, empty night. I'd been on the road since 11, and I was well into the early morning hours, that pocket of time where you stop feeling tired and start feeling like you're the only person awake in the world. The CB clicked. The voice was the same. I recognized it immediately. Same flat, informative tone. He said, "The left lane's blocked about 2 miles ahead. Semi-jackknifed. Take it easy." I checked the dash clock immediately that time. 3:17. I said out loud to myself, "Okay," and I moved to the right lane. About 2 miles ahead, a semi-truck was jackknifed across the left lane, its cab at an angle, hazard lights strobing orange into the dark. A flare had been set on the road, but it had mostly burned down. I slowed and navigated carefully around it. The voice had been right again. The voice had been exactly right. And it had come at exactly 3:17, and I have never been able to explain that to myself in a way that doesn't leave a residue of unease. I left that job eventually for unrelated reasons. I still drive at night sometimes, in my own car. I don't have a CB particular use for it, just because it felt like keeping a piece of how he spent his nights. I installed it in my own truck about a year after he died, mostly for sentimental reasons. I drove a lot for my own job. Pharmaceutical sales, which meant covering a wide rural territory and putting serious miles on every week. Having the CB made the long drives feel slightly less lonely. It made me feel connected to him in a strange way I can't fully explain. This was 3 years ago. I was covering a territory that stretched across 2 states, and I had a particularly heavy week that required multiple overnight drives to make all my appointments. On a Thursday night. Or Friday morning, technically. I was on an interstate I'd driven 100 times, heading to an early appointment in a city about 3 hours away. It was late, probably past 2, and I was doing fine on coffee and the kind of low-grade alertness that long drivers develop. The CB had been my father's for a long time. It was an older model, and it picked up some frequencies clearly and others with static. I'd gotten used to its quirks. At some point in the early morning, I heard a voice come through. Older man, the kind of measured, unhurried voice that reminded me immediately of my father and the way he talked. He said, "There's a deer crossing about 8 miles up, the whole family of them. They've been crossing that stretch every night this week." I eased off the accelerator slightly, filed it away. At approximately the right distance, my headlights caught 4 deer at the side of the road. A doe and 3 younger ones, and one of them was already moving onto the asphalt. I had slowed enough that I was able to stop completely and wait while they crossed. The last one paused in my headlights and looked at me for a long moment before it moved into the dark on the other side. I sat there after they'd gone. My hands were resting on the wheel, and I was looking at the empty road and thinking about the voice, because it sounded like my father. I don't mean it was my father. I'm not telling you that. I'm not a person who believes in that kind of thing, or at least I wasn't then. I mean, the voice had the same rhythm, the same unhurried quality, the same Midwestern flatness that I associated with him that I'd grown up with. I knew it was a projection. I knew that. The mind does things with grief that aren't rational. But I picked up the handset and said, "Thanks. I appreciate that." And the voice, after a pause, said, "Drive safe, kid." That's what my father used to say when I was little, and he'd be leaving for a long run. I'd wake up early to see him off sometimes, and he'd rub my head and say, "Drive safe, kid," which didn't even make sense because I was 8 years old, but it was his thing, his phrase. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I checked the clock on the dash. I don't remember why I did it. Habit, maybe. Something in me needed to anchor the moment. 3:17 a.m. I drove the rest of the way with the CB volume turned low, not all the way off, just low. I don't know what I was hoping to hear. I don't know what I was afraid of. I never heard that voice again. I still have the radio. Some nights I turn it on during long drives and just listen to the static and try not to think about it too carefully. The next account comes from someone who worked the overnight shift at a highway rest stop. Not a driver, but close enough to the road to hear everything that moved through it. Story 6. The Rest Stop Attendant. People assume rest stops are boring, and mostly they are. But on certain nights, in certain hours, they accumulate a particular atmosphere that I've never found anywhere else. I worked the overnight shift at a state-run rest stop on a major interstate for just under 2 years. My job was simple: keep the facilities clean, make sure the vending machines stayed stocked, call highway patrol if anything required it, and log any unusual incidents in a paper binder that no one ever seemed to read. The facility had a small attendant station with a window facing the parking lot, a radio that picked up emergency frequencies, and an older CB unit that had been there when I started and that I was told I could use if I needed to reach truckers directly about facility issues. Sometimes if the truck lot was full, I'd get on and let drivers know before they pulled in. I want to describe the particular quiet of a rest stop at 3 a.m. It's different from ordinary quiet. There are the sounds of the interstate beyond the tree line, a constant low presence, engines at distance, and then close in, occasional vehicles pulling off and parking and going still. Sometimes a truck engine idling, insects in summer, silence in winter. The lights in the parking lot cast a yellowish glow that doesn't quite reach the edges. I was in my 3rd month when the first transmission came. I'd been on the CB once or twice for legitimate purposes. That night I'd left it on mostly because the silence had gotten heavy in a way I didn't like. There was a storm moving through. No rain yet, but a pressure in the air that made everything feel slightly wrong. The transmission came in around 3:15 in the morning. A voice, male, calm. He said, "Rest stop coming up in about 10 miles. Northbound. If you've got passengers, might want to stop. There's weather moving in fast, and the highway is going to be rough in about an hour." I listened. It was an odd transmission. Benign, even helpful. But something about it nagged at me because he was describing my rest stop. Northbound, 10 miles out. That was us. What nagged me was the second part. He said weather was coming in fast and would make the highway rough in about an hour. I checked the weather app on my phone. The radar showed the storm about 40 minutes out, moving at a pace that would put it on the highway in roughly an hour. He was right. He was exactly right. I got on the CB and thanked him and asked where he was monitoring the weather from. No response. About 45 minutes later, the storm came through hard. Not dangerous, but heavy rain and wind, the kind that reduces visibility significantly. Several vehicles pulled off over the next hour and waited it out in the lot. One of them was a family with kids, who came in grateful and soaked and said they'd almost not stopped, but had heard a CB warning about the weather and decided it was worth pulling off. I asked them what channel they'd picked it up on. The father told me it was the channel I'd heard the transmission on. I asked if they knew what time they'd heard it. He thought about it, checked his phone, said they'd been running a navigation app, and the timestamp on a photo his daughter had taken just before they pulled off, was 3:17. I wrote it in the incident log. I don't know why, it just seemed like something I should record. I heard similar transmissions 3 or 4 more times over my 2 years there. Not all of them were timed the same way, but 2 were, and in both of those cases, what the voice described came up to pass within the hour. I stopped working that job when the facility was closed for renovations, and I was transferred to a different location. I don't have access to a CB at the new facility. I find I think about those transmissions more than I expected to. There's a particular feeling that comes from receiving information you couldn't have had and then watching it prove accurate. It's not exactly comfortable. It's closer to the feeling of being watched by something you can't see. Not threatened. Just observe. Story 6. Trail crew. I worked for a land conservancy for 3 seasons doing trail maintenance in the Adirondacks. Part of the job involved multi-day stays at remote work sites. You'd pack in your tools and your food and your gear, and you'd be out there for 4 or 5 days at a stretch, working alone or with one other person, camping in whatever flat spot you could find near the section you were maintaining. It's demanding work, physical work, and at the end of a day, on trail, you sleep like you're dead. I liked that about the job. I liked having nothing left over at the end of the day. The incident happened during my 2nd season on a solo stint in the eastern section. My partner that week had a family emergency and had to leave on day 2, and the conservancy asked if I was comfortable finishing the section alone. I was. I'd worked solo before and I preferred it in some ways. The night it happened was the 3rd night of a 4-day stretch. I camped in a flat area near a beaver pond, about 6 miles from the nearest road. The work had gone well. I was tired in a good way. I woke up around 3, give or take. Not gradually, I was just suddenly and completely awake, the way you get when something outside of normal parameters has registered. The footsteps were already in progress when I surfaced. They were moving around the right side of my tent, clear and deliberate over the dry ground, not fast, not slow, the pace of someone taking a walk. I lay still and listened to them complete a full orbit. Then another. Now. I've worked in a remote wilderness for years. I've heard animals at night, up close, in ways that most people haven't. I've had bears walk within 20 feet of my tent. I've listened to fishers scream in the dark. I've heard moose moving through wet areas in the pre-dawn hours. I know what animal movement sounds like. There are specific things about the way animals move. Variation in pace, pausing, the irregular cadence of something navigating terrain by instinct. This had none of that. The footsteps were regular, consistent, almost metronomic. After the third orbit, I called out, not loudly, just in a normal voice. "I hear you. I'm awake." The footsteps stopped. I stayed awake until about 5 and then gave up on sleep and started breaking camp. I finished the trail section that day and hiked out a full day early, something I'd never done before on a work stint. I wrote up the incident the way we're supposed to write up unusual events in the field. My supervisor read it. She didn't say much. Later, she told me that the eastern section had a history of similar reports. Not many, but some. Maintenance workers, hunters, hikers who'd camped in that general area and reported unexplained sounds at night. She said they'd never been able to determine a cause. I went back to that section the following season. The trail needed work, and it was my assignment. I did the job. I camped at a different site each night, staying away from the beaver pond area. Nothing happened. But the whole time I was out there, I felt observed in a way I couldn't pin down. Not threatened, just watched. The way you feel when you're in a room and you're not entirely sure you're alone. Another experience that still doesn't sit right. This one from a retired school teacher who took up long-distance hiking after her children were grown. Story 7. The Long Trail. I was 53 when I did my first long section hike. I know that sounds late in life for that kind of thing, but I'd been a steady day hiker for years and the transition felt natural. My youngest had just started college, my husband was supportive, and I'd been talking about doing a significant piece of the Long Trail in Vermont for as long as I could remember. I did 2 weeks that first summer, section hiking southbound, staying at the shelters when they had space and tenting when they didn't, or when I wanted more privacy. I've done my research, I was prepared, and for the first 9 or 10 days, everything was lovely. Hard and beautiful and exactly what I needed. The night I'm thinking of was near the end of the trip. I was tired in a way that had started to go past physical. That deep depletion that comes from sustained solitude and sustained effort. I'd chosen to tent that night rather than use the shelter. I wanted to be alone with my thoughts. I set up in a designated tenting area about a 1/4 mile off the main trail. It was a quiet spot, level, sheltered on 3 sides by hemlocks. I made dinner, wrote in my journal for a while, and turned in around 9. I was asleep almost immediately. I woke up just after midnight. I'd checked my watch this time, specifically because I wanted to be able to record the details later. The sound was unmistakable. Footsteps, moving slowly around the outside of my tent, not close enough to feel threatening, but close enough to hear clearly the compression of the soft forest floor, the occasional faint crunch where a stick lay under the leaf layer. I sat up and listened. What struck me immediately, and what I noted in my journal the next morning, was the pace. It was deliberate in a way that felt intentional, not the variable rhythm of an animal investigating a smell, not the urgent movement of something passing through, just a slow, steady circuit of my tent. It went around once, around again. I've raised 3 children. I've sat up with sick kids in the middle of the night. I've had a long career managing 30 students in a classroom at once. I don't rattle easily, but there in that hemlock grove at 12:15 in the morning, alone and 6 miles from the nearest road, I will tell you honestly that I was frightened in a way that took me by surprise. I picked up my trekking pole, I'd kept it in the tent and held it. The footsteps completed a third circuit and were beginning a fourth when I said, quite clearly, "Please stop." They stopped. I sat there in silence for a very long time. I want to be honest about the fact that I didn't know whether to be relieved or more frightened, because please stop is a human request. You say, please stop when you're asking something that understands language, and I hadn't meant to choose those words. They just came out. I didn't sleep again that night, and at first light I packed up quickly and got back on the trail. I hiked 5 miles before I stopped for breakfast. My hands shook a little while I ate. I finished my section of that trip, and I've gone back to the long trail twice since. I've never had another incident like that one. But I notice that I always choose to sleep in the shelters now, even when I'd prefer privacy. And whenever I'm in a shelter and I can hear someone else's quiet breathing nearby, I'm grateful for it in a way I never was before. This one comes from a man who brought his teenage son camping. A trip that was meant to be about time together, about passing something down. Story 8. The son. My son had just turned 16. It was August, a couple years ago. He and I had been talking for months about doing a real backcountry trip together, not car camping, not a developed campground, but actual wilderness. Packs on our backs, sleeping where we made camp. He was at the age where he needed to know he was capable of hard things, and I wanted to be the one to show him. We went into the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania. 4 days, 3 nights. The first 2 days were good. Hard hiking in the heat, some good conversations while we walked. The particular kind of ease between a father and son that only comes when you're both tired and outdoors and have nowhere to be. The third night we camped on a ridge overlooking a hollow. It was a beautiful spot. We ate and talked for a long time after dark, and he told me some things about school and his friends that I don't think he would have told me sitting in our kitchen at home. Those conversations are the reason you take the trips. We turned in around 10:30. He was in his tent, me in mine, maybe 15 feet apart. I fell asleep, and then I woke up and didn't know why. I lay there in the dark, oriented myself, remembered where I was. The forest was quiet in the way August forests are quiet. That full, layered silence underneath the insect sounds. And then I heard footsteps. They were on my side of the camp, moving along the right side of my tent. Slow, clear, deliberate. I tracked them around to the back, around to the left. I got up onto my elbows. I was trying to determine the size of whatever was out there from the sound. The steps were heavier than a deer, too rhythmic for a bear. I'm familiar with bear activity, and there was no sniffing, no rooting, no pause and investigate behavior. Just that even, circular walk. The footsteps moved past my tent toward my son's tent, and I felt something I very rarely feel. A pure, cold, protective fear. Not for myself, for him. But the footsteps didn't cross to his tent. They came back around mine, completing another orbit. I was reaching for my flashlight when I heard my son's voice from his tent. "Dad? Dad, is that you walking around?" The footsteps stopped. We were both awake then. I called back to him quietly and told him to stay in his tent and not come out. I grabbed the flashlight and unzipped and swept the perimeter. Nothing. The disturbed leaves in a rough circle around my tent. Trees at the edge of the beam. Nothing else. He was frightened, my son, more than he wanted to show. We sat outside together for about an hour. I built the fire back up, and he told me he'd been hearing the footsteps for a while before he said anything. He'd convinced himself it was me, getting up to walk around the way I sometimes do when I can't sleep. He'd waited a long time before speaking, and the footsteps had stopped the moment he did. I want to be careful about what I tell my son that experience means. He's at an age where the framework he builds around unexplained things will shape how he handles unexplained things for the rest of his life. So I've told him it was probably an animal. Probably something with predictable animal behavior we don't recognize at the moment. I believe that myself, approximately 60% of the time. The other 40% I think about the fact that the footsteps stopped the moment a voice emerged from inside the tent, and I don't know what to do with that. The following account is from a woman who had camped alone dozens of times without incident, until she camped near a location she would later learn had an unusual history. Story 9. The history of a place. I do a lot of research before a trip. Trail conditions, water sources, bear activity, weather patterns. I like to go in knowing as much as I can. I am careful and prepared, and I don't take unnecessary risks. What I didn't research before the trip I'm about to describe was the history of the land itself. I was in the Cumberland Plateau region of Tennessee, in a section of state forest that doesn't see heavy use. I'd found the area on a topographic map, a flat bench below a cliff line with seasonal water nearby, off trail, well away from any marked route, the kind of place you go when you genuinely want to disappear for a while. The first 2 nights were completely ordinary. The bench was exactly what the map suggested. Flat, sheltered, peaceful. I slept well. The days were spent reading and walking short distances and doing the particular nothing that is the whole point of that kind of trip. The third night, I woke up and heard footsteps circling my tent. I know how that sounds. I know that by this point, if you've been listening to these accounts, it sounds like a story mechanism, a way of setting up what follows. I can only tell you that it happened, and that it happened in the way I'm describing, and that I responded the way any experienced solo camper would. I lay still. I listened. I cataloged what I was hearing and tried to match it to what I knew. The steps were measured. They didn't pause or investigate. They moved in a consistent orbit around my tent, close enough that I could hear the brush of something through the knee-high grass on the east side of my camp. 1 circuit, 2, 3. I spoke. I said, "Who's there?" More because I'd run out of convincing animal explanations than because I seriously expected a response. The footsteps stopped. In the morning, I broke camp and hiked out without finishing my planned last day. On the drive home, I did what I should have done before. I looked into the history of that specific section of the plateau. I won't tell you what I found exactly because I don't want to lead you toward a particular interpretation. I'll tell you that the area has a history that includes loss. The specific kind of loss that leaves something behind in a place. The land has been the site of things I won't describe, decades ago, before it was forest again. Other people had camped in that general area and noted unusual experiences. Not all of them were willing to elaborate. I'm not a person who believes in haunted ground. I'm not sure I believe in it now, even after this. What I believe is that some places accumulate a quality that we don't have precise language for. Some land holds something the way old wood holds a smell. Not present to everyone, not present all the time, but real enough when you're close to it. I've tried to find a way to explain what I heard that third night that doesn't require me to accept things I'm not prepared to accept. I haven't managed it yet. This last account is from a man who, by the time he sent it, had spent over a decade trying to understand what happened to him during one night in the Pacific Northwest. Story 10. The decade after. There are things you carry with you from an experience that you don't realize you're carrying until you set them down. I've had a hard time setting this one down. It was 11 years ago. I was 25, working a seasonal job in Washington State and camping in the Olympic Peninsula on my days off. I had a spot I'd been using regularly, a flat area near a creek in the temperate rainforest, in a part of the park that wasn't heavily trafficked. I'd slept there 4 or 5 times without incident. It felt like mine, the way a spot feels like yours when you've spent enough quiet time in it. The night it happened was in September. The rainforest in September is spectacularly, almost aggressively alive. The air is dense and green. The undergrowth is thick. The moss absorbs sound in a way that makes the whole environment feel padded, muffled, close. It's beautiful in the daytime. At night, it becomes something else. I was asleep, and then I wasn't. The transition was abrupt, the way it is when something breaks through. I lay still in the dark. The darkness in a rainforest on a cloudy night is total, no gradations, no ambient light. And I listened. Footsteps, already in progress, moving around the left side of my tent with a pace that was completely, utterly deliberate. I have thought many times about what word I would use to describe the quality of those footsteps. The word I keep coming back to is purposeful. They had a quality of intention that animal movement rarely carries. There was no hesitation, no variation, no sense of exploration. They were moving around my tent the way you move around something you've already decided to move around. Circuit 1, Circuit 2. The moss and rain-softened ground of that part of the rainforest muffled some of the sound, but I could hear enough. The press of weight against saturated ground, the occasional wet compression of something plant-based. Heavy enough to be something large, regular enough to seem deliberate. I lay there for a long time. I don't know how long. Time becomes strange in total darkness when your heart is loud in your ears. I started to calculate options. I had a knife. I had a headlamp. I had a small air horn I carried as a deterrent for wildlife. I thought about the air horn. I thought about the knife. I thought about staying very, very still. After what I later estimated was 6 or 7 complete circuits, the footsteps stopped. Not gradually, not trailing off. They stopped between one step and the next, as if a switch had been thrown. I hadn't made a sound. I hadn't moved. I hadn't spoken. The footsteps just stopped. And then, this is the part I've never told many people, because I don't know what it means, and I don't want to seem like I'm embellishing. I heard something else. After the footsteps stopped, in the silence that followed, there was a sound that I can only describe as an exhale. Long, slow, close. The sound of something breathing out. Just once, and then nothing. I lay there until the sky outside my tent went from black to dark green to gray. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. I barely breathed. When I got out of the tent at dawn, the ground around me told me nothing specific. The moss was compressed in places, but moss compresses easily and recovers slowly, and I couldn't tell what was my footprint and what was something else's. I drove home that day. I called in sick to work for 2 days and sat in my apartment trying to understand what had happened. I've been camping many times since. I'm not afraid of the woods. I don't believe, in any straightforward sense, in things that can't be explained by physical causes. But every time I'm lying in a tent at night and the darkness gets complete and the forest gets quiet, there's a moment, just a moment, where I wait, where I hold my breath and I listen, and I wait to hear whether something out there is beginning to move in a circle. The listening never quite stops. I don't think it ever will. These accounts came from different people in different parts of the country, spanning more than a decade. They were told by a mechanic, a teacher, a conservation worker, a father, a 19-year-old who needed to prove something to himself. None of them know each other. None of them had any reason to share the details they shared. The stopping when a voice emerges, the exact and unhurried patience of the circling, the silence that follows that, is somehow more unsettling than the sound itself. There's no tidy conclusion to offer, no explanation that absorbs all the details cleanly and leaves nothing over. What we're left with is a pattern repeated across distance and time, in rainforest and hardwood flat, on ridgelines and river benches, in summer and deep November cold. Something that moves in circles in the dark. Something that listens. Something that seems to understand that you are inside. The most unsettling thing, perhaps, is the quiet, not the footsteps. You can tell yourself an explanation for footsteps. It's the silence that follows the first spoken word, the precise, immediate, knowing silence, as if whatever was outside had been waiting to confirm something, and the moment you spoke, it had its answer. Whatever you make of that, Whatever you decide it means about the nature of these woods and these nights and the things that move through both. I hope the morning comes quickly for you tonight. Sleep well, listen carefully, and if you hear something circling, be very thoughtful about whether you want to speak. Story 11. What She Heard. This account is not mine. I want to be upfront about that. It belongs to my wife, who drove overnight freight for a regional company for several years before we had kids, and she moved to a daytime schedule. She's not someone who tells this kind of story. She's practical, empirical, skeptical of anything she can't source. When she told me what happened, she told it straight, without embellishment, and asked me not to offer explanations. She said she tried all the explanations herself, and none of them fully worked, and she didn't want to hear more of them. What she told me was this. She was on a run through the upper Midwest, heading north on a 2-lane state highway she'd been on many times. The night was cold and clear. The road was empty. The CB was on. She wasn't really listening to it. A voice came through and gave a weather report, detailed, specific. Not the kind of broad strokes report you hear on the radio, but something like what a local meteorologist gives when they're briefing emergency services. Current temperature at specific mile markers. Wind speed and direction. Where a frost line was sitting on the road surface. She noted the information because it was useful. She adjusted her speed slightly. Then the voice said, "Drive safe, Karen." Her name is Karen. She didn't respond. She told me she felt the words go through her like cold water, and she didn't respond. She has never told anyone on the CB her name. She's never broadcast personal information. She's worked under a handle on the radio, the way most drivers do. No one on that channel had any reason to know her name. When she got home from that run, she told me she'd checked the time on a trip log for that stretch of highway. She has a habit of noting entry and exit times on each segment. The transmission had come between 2 timestamps. The window was 5 minutes long. The window ran from 3:15 to 3:20. She said she was fairly certain it was closer to the end of that window, around 3:17 or 3:18. I asked her how she felt about it. She said she felt unsettled, but not frightened. She said it felt, and this is her word, it felt kind. Like the information was intended to help, and the name was. She paused here for a while. She said the name felt like it was meant to tell her she hadn't been mistaken, that it was really for her. She doesn't drive nights anymore for practical reasons unrelated to this. But she told me once, quietly, that she wasn't sure she'd want to go back to it. Not because she was afraid, because she wasn't sure she could handle hearing her name again and having to pretend it didn't mean something. Story 12. The Last Thing He Said. My uncle ran long haul for decades. He retired about 5 years ago, and now he sits in a recliner and watches television and claims to be bored, but he had a good run. He's the one who first told me about the 317 voice. He told me when I was just starting out driving, like he was passing along a piece of road folklore. He said other drivers had mentioned it to him over the years. A voice on the CB in the deep early morning, always around 317, always warning about something ahead, always right. He was matter-of-fact about it. He said the road had all kinds of strange things, and that strange things accumulated where people spent a lot of time in isolation, and that the highway was one of the loneliest places on Earth, even when it was crowded. I asked him if he'd ever heard the voice himself. He said once. He said it was on a night run through a mountain corridor, about 15 years before we were having that conversation. He said the transmission came through clearly, despite the terrain, which he'd mentioned because mountain corridors usually ate signal, and the voice gave him a warning about a rock slide on the road ahead. He'd slowed and found the rocks, small but scattered across the lane, and navigated through. He said the voice had said one other thing that night, after the warning, just before the transmission ended. He'd said, "You've got a long road ahead of you yet. My uncle went quiet for a moment after telling me that. Then he said, "I like to think he was right. He's still alive, sitting in that recliner." He was right. But I've thought about that phrase since he told me. A long road ahead of you yet. It's a reassurance, but it's a specific kind. It implies knowledge of duration, of the length of someone's future. It implies something about how much road is left, which means it could also be said to someone for whom the road is shorter. And presumably that version isn't said at all. Presumably if the road ahead isn't long, the voice doesn't say anything. Or maybe it says something different, something neither of us would want to hear. I've been driving at night for 4 years now. I've heard things on the CB that I've written off and things I've taken seriously. I've never heard the voice. Not yet. I keep my CB on when I drive. I keep the channel consistent. And when the clock edges toward 3 in the morning on a quiet road, I pay attention. Not because I'm afraid. Because if the voice has information about the road ahead, I want to hear it. And if it has nothing to say to me, I want to know that too. I want to hear the silence that means the road is clear and long and still mine. Story 13. What the last driver said. I collected this account over the course of several weeks from a man I met at a truck stop diner on a gray morning when neither of us was in a hurry. He'd been retired from driving for about a year and was just passing through, visiting family a few states over. He had the look of someone who'd spent years alone in a cab. Not lonely, exactly, but accustomed to his own company in a way that made conversation feel optional. He'd heard I'd been asking around about the 317 transmissions, word travels on certain frequencies. He sat down across from me with his coffee and told me he had one more account to add and that I could do with it whatever I thought was right. He said he'd been driving for 32 years and that in the last year of his career, the transmissions had become more frequent. Not every night. Nothing like that. But several times over those final 12 months, the voice had come through with information about what was ahead, accurate every time, down to the mile. He said toward the end, he'd started talking back, not asking questions exactly, just responding, saying thank you. Sometimes saying he'd gotten the message, that he was slowing down, that he'd seen the thing the voice had described. And he said the voice had started responding in kind. Not long exchanges. Nothing like a conversation. Just acknowledgments. A simple confirmation that the information had been received and acted on. And then, on his last run, the last overnight route before his retirement, which he'd known at the time was his last. The transmission had come at 3:17, and the voice had given him a clear road. Nothing ahead. He was okay. And then the voice had said something it had never said before, in 32 years of his driving, in all the accounts he'd collected from other drivers, in every version of the story he'd heard. It said, "It was good driving with you." He stopped talking then and looked at his coffee. I didn't say anything for a while. Eventually I asked him what he thought it meant, who he thought it was, what he thought the 317 transmissions actually were. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "I think the road has a memory. I think all the miles and all the nights and all the people who drove those roads left something behind, something that knows the road the way no person could, and I think whatever it is, it watches. And sometimes it helps." He finished his coffee and said he needed to get going. I watched him walk out to his truck. He was driving his own now, a pickup for pleasure. And I watched him pull onto the highway and disappear in the morning light. I don't know if I believe what he said. I don't know if I believe any single explanation for any of these accounts. What I believe is that the accounts are real, that the people who told them are telling the truth as they understand it, and that something happened to them on those roads in those early morning hours that they have not been able to satisfactorily explain. Closing. There are roads in this country that have been driven for generations. And there are people who have spent whole careers on them, whole lifetimes of nighttime miles. Whatever accumulates in those miles, routine, loneliness, attention, the long practice of watching what's ahead. Maybe it doesn't simply disappear when the driver retires or the truck goes quiet. Maybe something of it remains. Maybe it moves through channels we built for other purposes, through frequencies we thought we understood. Maybe it arrives at 3:17 in a calm voice with accurate information about a road you haven't reached yet. And maybe the only thing it asks of you is to listen. Drive safe.